so that people can watch elsewhere. It's a small group at the moment, so I'm going to say type your questions in the chat box, but we might ask for clarification, or if you want to share any other information, we might be able to just let us know, and we can let you unmic yourself and have a little chat. Today we have with us Matt DiBona and Ben Vicere from the National Wild Turkey Federation to talk to us a little bit about turkeys. Vermont Coverts is really excited to have them here on Zoom with us to share information and how, you know, managing for turkeys also affects other species. And so I'm going to turn it over to Matt to start off, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Take it away, Matt.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. My name's Matt. I'm the New England District Biologist for the National Wild Turkey Federation. I'm kind of excited to talk to you guys today. I think that turkeys is one of those things we sort of take for granted. There's so many of them, but really, when you step back and think about it, they're sort of like one of the defining conservation success stories of our times. Now, I guess, you know, there's enough of you guys in here. How many of you can remember seeing turkeys when you were a kid? Probably not many of you, right? But how many of you seen turkeys in the last few weeks? Most all of you, right? And that's because a lot has happened around wild turkeys in the last 40 years, and my organization was a part of that. So what I kind of want to, I'm going to share my screen here and stuff, but you know, want to let me do this first here. All right, that's there. Try this one more time here. Is it working? Or should I be able to see it? You guys can all see it?
It's working. You just need to be in presentation mode.
Presentation mode. Okay.
Perfect.
Now we good?
There we go.
All right.
Yep.
I think what Ben and I really want to talk about is put some context around this, right? I mean, we see turkeys everywhere, but really there's a lot going on behind the scenes that have contributed to this bird's success, and a lot of factors that are affecting its survival. And believe it or not, you know, I'll talk about more of this later. There's parts of the country where turkeys are going through substantial declines, and while we're not seeing that in Vermont or New England right now, at least I don't think so, you know, there's either the possibility that we're going to get there and go down that same road, or perhaps we're going to go down a different path. But either way, as private landowners, you guys have an important opportunity to help manage your property to benefit turkeys, and in doing so, you're going to benefit a variety of other wildlife. So, you know, I think talking just a little bit about who we are. We were formed in 1973, back when there really weren't a lot of turkeys. At that time, there was estimated to be only a million and 1.3 million turkeys in the U.S., and that was down nearly 90% from where we think birds were in pre-settlement times. And the reasons for that are probably pretty well known, and I think Vermont's a good example of this as well, is that, you know, turkeys were a really important food source for a lot of pioneers, a lot of folks that were colonizing parts of New England and the nation. But like anything else, you know, we were kind of given away to unregulated hunting, clearing of large chunks of forest, right? And that we know happened in Vermont. And so, you know, what happened in Vermont was really a microcosm for what happened in the rest of the country. And we saw the turkey eradicated from most of its range by 1920. You know, it was eradicated from 18 out of 39 states. And it really stayed like that for the next 40 to 50 years. So right around the 50s, you know, there were still some areas in the country that had turkeys. Most places, particularly the Northeast, had none. New York did have some. And people started thinking about, well, how are we going to return turkeys to the landscape? And, you know, our first instinct was to start raising birds in releasing them into the wild, and that was an utter failure because those birds did not have the instincts or abilities to avoid predators. Survival was incredibly poor, and those efforts failed almost every time. And so they kind of had to go back to the drawing board. You know, when they first started thinking about restoring turkeys, the only places there were turkeys left were in parts of the southeast, parts of the forested north and Midwest and stuff. So people assumed that turkeys needed huge hundreds and hundreds of acres of continuous forest to be able to survive. And you know, when we look out our windows today and we see turkeys in every field and backyard and power line corridor and stuff, we realize that that's not true. Forests factor into things, but turkeys really use a variety of habitats. So after those farm-raised birds failed, they started looking at this idea of, well, what happens if we caught birds in the wild from one area and move them to another, you know, if we know they have the habitat. And once they started getting that technique down, it was really successful. And the way it typically worked was, you know, as most of you know, turkeys are gregarious birds. They tend to hang out in flocks, and flocks are often largest in the wintertime. And also, you know, particularly in the Northeast, that happens to be when food availability is often restricted due to, you know, time of year, snow cover, that sort of thing. So they found that trying to trap birds in the wintertime using bait was very effective, but they had to develop a capture technique to do it because the birds are surprisingly quick. They're not graceful flyers, but they're incredibly fast running, and they can still flush really fast, almost like a pheasant. So they started looking at cannon nets and rocket nets, and with a lot of jiggering and stuff, they really got this technique down, and that's how turkeys were brought back to Vermont. Your population for turkeys in Vermont, the birds you see today, have a high likelihood of originating from a small handful of birds that came out of New York in the late 60s and 70s. They were restored to Paulette and then Hubbardton. And what happened was those birds took off like wildfire. And once those populations started getting ground, they were able to go back into those populations, trap those birds, and move them around the state. So within a period of about 20, 25 years, turkeys have been restored to most of Vermont that was able to support them. And turkeys, turkeys historically have been in the southern portion of Vermont, but never in the northern part. And I think just through changes in the landscape, more disturbance, more presence of people, agriculture, that sort of thing, they expanded farther north than I think we ever thought they would. I mean, they're in, they go right to the very northern part of Maine right now, which never would have been thought believable back in the 70s. So I've already demonstrated I'm a little technologically challenged here, but if I can pull this next thing off, I have a video from work that we had done. This talks more just about the trap and transfer. Again, swapping birds all around the state. You can see that within 5 years of releasing birds, Vermont had its first spring season, and it was very small. The fall season came later. I'll talk a little bit about the hunting season stuff, but if people have more questions, we can get into it deeper. But if you look at from those very modest beginnings, your annual spring harvest now is generally above 5,000 birds every spring, which is phenomenal, and your population tolerates it. There's no signs that your population is in decline, and that's because most of your harvest pressure is really directed towards males as much as possible. But I got a cool video. We were helping out University of Maine with a research project these last few years, and it involved capturing birds and putting radios on them. But we had a videographer come out from Mossy Oak to collect some footage of things. So this is a really cool video of what it looks like when a rocket net actually goes off. So you can see the birds can react very, very quickly, right? I mean, if that net had been angled any higher, we would have had a bunch more birds slip out underneath it. And so, we were stashed in the corner about 30 yards away. I've never seen a capture event go off as smooth as this did. We got there at about 6 o'clock. We could already hear birds calling in the trees. It was just starting to get light. We were running, and within 5 minutes of hopping in the truck to sit and wait, we had birds cross the street and walk right into the bait area. Netted 75% of them. no mortalities. I've never seen anything go that smoothly, and with a camera running, no less. So that was a really neat event for us. I want to spend some time talking about probably the most critical time of year for turkeys, which is going on right now, and this is the breeding season. So I mentioned that in the wintertime is when you see these big flocks of turkeys. Those of you that you know are maybe turkey hunters or birders, you see that these flocks tend to break up at the end of winter going into spring, and they start to form smaller flocks of adult males, which we call toms. Sometimes there'll be juvenile flocks of jakes. You'll see similar flocks of females, which we call hens. And in all cases, these birds have established a dominance or a pecking order, right? And what we find is that it's those dominant males that do the majority of breeding. So if you've ever driven by in a field and you've seen, a tom out there strutting, and or gobbling, making all these vocalizations, walking around the hen, trying to get her to like pick me, right? And it is indeed the hen that chooses the male. So when she's found a mate, she'll go lead him off into the woods. They'll copulate. What's unique is that the hen is able to hold the sperm inside her oviduct for upwards of 4 weeks, which is a really unique, strategy. And she may copulate with multiple males before she starts laying. So it's really a strategy that helps increase genetic diversity. She can actually lay a clutch of eggs that would have been fertilized by different males. And so it also allows her to balance a little bit against the weather, not a lot, but it's a very interesting thing where the dominant hens are the ones that get first crack at breeding. As they go off and get bred and start laying and stuff, some of those other hens will be bred as well. We'll move into the nesting season. Some of those nests will fail. Some of those hens will be back out in the fields trying to breed with gobblers. The breeding season, you can hear a bird gobbling any time of the year. The breeding season really gets going in April, late March, April, and will extend right into July. So I covered that. All right, nesting. Nesting is probably the most critical phase for wild turkeys for a variety of reasons, and this all will tie back into habitat later. Anybody ever seen a turkey nest in the wild? Ever bumped a hen or anything like that? It's not, yeah, Ben has, yeah, it's not much to look at, right? It's just a shallow depression or bowl. When she starts laying, there's generally no trees, no leaves on the trees. They're looking to lay in areas where there is existing ground cover, either from last year's vegetation, existing brush piles, sometimes at the base of a tree, and sometimes they will nest in places that make absolutely no sense to you or I. And so sometimes their second nest, if they fail the first time, will be in completely different habitat that just wasn't suitable then. But the way it works is she will lay 1 egg a day. Her average clutch size is going to be about 11 eggs. During that laying phase, she will go to her nest spot. She will spend a little time there, will lay an egg, and then she leaves for the day. She'll go back out and hang with the girls, or she'll be out, finding, food, whatever. And so, all right, I'm going to try my luck again and just kind of play this video. After she's laid that last egg, that is when she will start incubating. Now, the thing to keep in mind is she's taken 11 to 15 days to lay all those eggs. By the time she's finished incubating them 28 days later, all those eggs will hatch within the same 12 to 24-hour window. So it's really her temperature, that incubation temperature, that really controls egg development. So during that incubation period, this nesting period, this is when a hen is most vulnerable, okay? Typically, turkeys roost in trees. They sleep in trees. 9 months out of the year. The males 12 months out of the year. The males have it good, right? There's not a lot of predators that are going to kill a male turkey, and there's everything in the world that's out there trying to kill a hen, her eggs, or her poults. And she does it all alone. So once incubation starts, she's sitting on that nest roughly 22, 23 hours out of every day. She'll get off for maybe an hour in the morning or in the evening just to take a little bit of water and food. Hens tend to take two different strategies, right? There's some hens that will, excuse me, stay really tight to their nesting area, and then, you know, really be on that nest a lot. And then there are some that are more, you know, devil may care about it. They'll spend some time here, they'll go a little bit farther out, that sort of thing. And what you typically find is those hens that stick really tight to the nesting area, really try to do a good job, they are generally more successful in hatching a nest, but they also have a higher rate of getting predated. And the other hens that kind of adopt that more, you know, easy come, easy go strategy, they're less likely to hatch out or brood, but they're more likely to survive. So there's a lot going on. You can see the hen here, she's just, you know, testing, you know, rotating the eggs around, arranging the order and that sort of thing. I'll just bump it out here. So there's actually some poults here hanging around. So, you know, this whole phase, this month-long period, is when these birds are most vulnerable. They are trying to nest in an area where they can simultaneously be hidden, but also see what's going on around them. And, you know, you hear researchers talk about, you know, we always thought we kind of knew what was going on with nest site selection, right? They really want this areas with this good cover, this sort of thing. They spend, you know, weeks scouting out the perfect spot to lay their eggs. And what new technology with like radio telemetry or GPS telemetry data has shown is that it almost looked like these birds are making it up as they go. They're kind of moving into a new area that they sometimes have never been to. They're hanging out for a day or two, and then their body tells them it's time to start laying eggs, and that's when it all starts. And so, you know, there's a big question mark about what's going on with actual nest site selection and how that impacts nest success, because you've seen nests get predated in areas where you thought it was good cover, and you've seen birds pull off broods in areas where they should have no business being able to raise a nest, because there's a trail right next to them, or there's a bear that's going by every day, and for whatever reason it never bothers that hen or that nest. And there's just some things that we don't know. There's also this idea of I guess I want to talk a little bit about predators, but well, I guess I'll do it in a minute. Talking about home range and stuff, the average home range of a turkey is somewhere around 1,300 acres. There's a lot of variability in that. The home range is just the amount of land that they will use to meet their annual life cycle requirements, right? And that's spring through winter, okay? Within that incubation home range, when they're just sitting tight on that nest, that home range is only 20 acres. So they go from 1,300 acres to 20 acres. To put that in perspective, imagine you have a nice 2,400 square foot house, and you've got to spend a whole month locked in the bathroom. And that bathroom needs to have everything you need to meet all your life cycle requirements for that month. That's the scale of difference in home range that we're talking about. And it puts the bird at risk, because every day these birds are putting off scent, and that scent is staying in that area, right? And there's different things that can go on. There's some of these things that we don't know. Is there could be like these microclimate things that affect how scent moves in an area, so that maybe she hits the jackpot and she's in an area where that scent doesn't carry, and so it's not picked up by a fox or a coyote or a raccoon. There's other things that are going on, like precipitation events. So birds begin their peak incubation right around the beginning of May. That's when most birds start incubating. May also happens to be a pretty wet month. So if we get a couple rain events in May and those birds get wet, there's like this old saying that a wet hen is a dead hen, because her scent is that much more detectable by predators. And so there's just all these moving parts of, like, she's stuck in one area, her scent's all over the place, there's all these predators around her, and it's a gamble of whether or not she's going to make it. and that kind of leads into a discussion of how predators are important and how turkeys can avoid predators. So I said the world is sort of stacked against the hen. This is what a nest looks like. This is actually one that looks hatched. This is hatched. You can tell by the membranes pulled away from the eggshell. But there's just as likely a chance you would find a nest that had eggs all smashed, or there were no eggs at all. And researchers spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what predators are out there eating those nests. And there's, what they found is there's all sorts of predators that can go after a turkey in her nest. And so one of the most biggest culprits of nest predators are snakes. They're all over the place. They can wipe out a nest pretty easily. It's other things like raccoons, red fox, gray fox, coyote, bobcat, possum, crows, ravens. I mean, the list goes on. There's all sorts of things. And that's why, you see a lot of folks talk about, well, shouldn't we be doing more predator trapping and that sort of thing? And that's kind of like, that's a mixed bag, because if you're trying to improve nest success, it looks like you got to catch every critter in the forest, right? To really have an impact on nest survival. Because if you go in there and you do an active campaign to remove foxes or raccoons, there's something else that's going to kind of fill in that gap, and you can't do it. If you're trying to just improve overall survival, and you and your neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor, you guys all have a coordinated effort where you're going to do it yourself, or you're going to have a trapper make a sustained effort through time and space to catch a lot of those predators, then yeah, you can do it, but it's just not practical, and it's generally not seen on the landscape. So really the only way to counteract the impact of predators is to have quality habitat on the ground. So turkeys do have some things going for them. Now, they hang out in flocks most times of the year, right? And you see that in all sorts of animals, from like zebras out on the plains of Africa or whatever. More eyeballs, more bodies makes it more difficult for predators to sneak up and successfully kill an individual. The other thing is their vision. Anybody that's tried to hunt turkeys know that they have phenomenal eyesight. They can't smell anything, but they have like what's called monocular periscopic vision, and they just perceive the world differently than we do. Their eyes are on their sides instead of forward, but it allows them to have a much broader field of view of what's going on. So you'll see a turkey standing there kind of bobbing its head, and it's just doing its thing to get a better, bigger picture. It's how it actually gets depth perception. They don't have good vision at night, which is also kind of why they roost in trees, because there's less predators. Aside from maybe an owl and a couple stories I've heard of, like a cat getting them or something like that, there's not a lot of predators that are going to get a turkey on a tree. But generally speaking, breeding season is when there's the period of greatest mortality for both males and females. And we talked about it for females, but for males, it also kind of applies, just because they are singularly focused on breeding with hens. And they'll be out there strutting, competing with other jakes or other toms and stuff, and that's when a coyote can just sneak up on them and bag one right in front of you and stuff. So generally speaking, there is not much else that's going to take a male turkey throughout the year, aside from a car or a hunter. But it's for the most part, that breeding season is the bottleneck in the population in terms of predation. All that said, on average, turkeys live about 3 years, and males will on average live a little bit longer than females. So you're seeing about average replacement of about 30% a year. So if by some miracle that hen is able to hatch out that brood of poults, it's 28 days later. Almost immediately, they're born ready to go. Like I said, they have synchronous hatch. So within 12 to 24 hours, all those eggs have hatched out of that clutch of 10, 13, 14 birds. as soon as they hatch, that hen is trying to get them to leave that nest site as much as possible. Remember, all that scent is hanging around. It's a death trap. So the sooner she can get them away from that nest area, the better. Ideally, they'll get as far away as a quarter mile on that first day. And all she's really trying to do is lead them from that nesting habitat to what we call brooding habitat. And ideally, they should be close together on the landscape. But even if they've hatched and they've been able to move, they are not out of the woods yet. You know, it's the main culprits for adult predators will be, and actually anything that will prey on a turkey during the nesting season will also prey on a poult when it's young. Those first 2 weeks of life are when the greatest mortality is, right? Until those birds are old enough that they can get up into a tree with mom in the evening, you know, the fight's kind of against them. So this brood habitat is something that I think is a critical piece of the puzzle, and something where I think landowners can really have some impact. It's areas that are generally open areas. They're old fields. They have they could be power line right-of-ways. They could be old log landings, log roads, your backyard. I mean, they're areas that typically have higher concentrations of forbs and herbaceous vegetation, and most importantly, they have insects. Okay, this protein is key to helping these birds grow and develop. Those first 2 weeks, they are growing. They are like an insatiable pit. They just need more and more. And you can see here, this chart just kind of lists how fast they grow. You start out, you know, you see those little pictures, or a tiny little puffball. You've seen a turkey egg. You can imagine how tiny they are. Within 2 weeks, they're able to kind of get underneath mom, you know, up in a tree and stuff, and hang out. By the time 8 weeks have gone around, or 10 weeks, you know, they're the size of a rooster. And by this time of year, you know, you might have to look at them for a minute to kind of distinguish which one's the hen and which one is the poults. So just to put this in mind, we said the peak of incubation is generally that first week of May, which means peak hatching is the first week of June. So there are a bunch of turkeys on the landscape right now that are probably just about 3-4 weeks old, right? So just think about it as you're seeing birds on the landscape. Anybody seen any poults yet this year? Okay. This idea of a brood habitat, this is kind of what an example of good brood habitat could look like. It's got a high composition of forbs. It's got, you know, cover on each side. Ideally, it's got some shrubs in the field, a little bit of escape cover. You know, this is something where if you have good brood cover, good brood habitat with lots of insects, I mean, like I'm walking around and I'm, you know, got spiders scurrying out of the way, I'm picking up crickets, whatever it is. I want as many insects as possible, because that means the birds have to move around less to find food. The less they move around, the less chance they have of getting attacked by predators. So it's really high quality habitat can really have an impact on mitigating the effects of predation and predators. Now, I talked a little bit about how rain can impact nesting hens. This impact is just as important, if not more important, for those poults that actually live to hatch and survive those first week or two. Think about this year compared to last year. Last year, we got a boatload of rain at the beginning of June, and this year our June was relatively dry. If I'm interested in growing poults, I want that dry June more than anything, because if you get those cold June mornings in the early part of the month, and you get those rain events, you know, it really only takes you know, if you get a rain event that lasts, you know, off and on for 12 hours, and you get a temperature that drops to about 52, that's enough for those poults to go hypothermic, and they will suffer. You'll see a lot of poult mortality. So last spring had a very cold, wet spring during the hatch. That really negatively impacted our brood production. Whereas this year, I feel like it's the other way around. Hatch conditions were really optimal going into June, and I feel like we should have a really good hatch. And I've heard a lot of, excuse me, folks anecdotally saying they're seeing a lot of poults already. So And you can see as the birds start to get older, fewer and fewer of them can kind of fit under mom. So really the less rain we have the beginning of June until they're old enough to kind of thermoregulate better themselves, the better off they are. And so that kind of like ends the bottleneck, right? After 14 days, they can finally get up into a tree. Their survival starts to really go up. And what you'll find is then these brood flocks sort of mix together. If you guys have ever seen turkeys in a field, you'll often see 2 or 3 hens and 20 different poults running around. So there's multiple different family groups coming together. And again, it's all this idea of more eyeballs looking around the landscape to see predators before predators get them. All right, this is the take home right here, 7%. 7%. 80% of females will attempt to nest. That other 20%, there's any number of reasons why they won't do it. It could be poor physiological condition. Some may not be bred. Some actually demonstrate nest parasitism, where they will actually see where another hen is laying eggs, and then they will go dump an egg there or an egg here or there and stuff. It's fairly rare, but there are those hens that are like, man, I don't want to be a mom. I'm just going to go put my eggs somewhere else. So 80% of females will attempt to nest. Now, based on all the stuff and information I just gave you, only 20 to 25% of those nests will hatch out 1 or more poults. Okay. Of those 25%, only 35% will have a poult that lives 1 month. Remember, there's all these things. There's environmental conditions, there's predators, there's all sorts of things that are affecting those birds for that first 2 weeks, month of life. When you boil that down, only 7% of hens will have at least 1 poult that survives to the fall. Okay. The deck is stacked against the turkey. That things have been so successful that we still have so many more birds. I mean, there's a lot of different things at play here, but you can start to see how critical that nesting season is in determining the trajectory of populations. Excuse me. And even after these birds are full grown, there are still some predators that can get them. Really, it's things like owls, bobcats, coyotes, and then man. And it's just, for us, most of it is just through harvest pressure. Just quickly to put things in context so that you can understand how harvest management is designed to be sustainable for turkeys. I said that peak of incubation is occurring in the beginning of May. Okay, that means that subtract 14 days or whatever for each day that she was laying an egg. A lot of those birds are being bred in April. Okay, so the idea is we don't have our spring turkey season until most of the birds have been bred, they've laid their eggs, and they're about to start incubating. The idea is that you protect that investment and have all those nests on the landscape before you start hunting. So our spring turkey season in Vermont doesn't start till May 1st. And that is by design, because like I said, we're hearing birds in March. We know they're breeding in April, but we wait to have the hunting season until most of those birds are already trying on their first nest. And remember, a lot of those nests are going to fail. Re-nesting does occur. It's variable depending on whether it's an adult hen or a juvenile hen, but it can be somewhere anywhere from 30 to 60% of your birds will attempt a second nest if the first one fails. Generally, they're smaller clutch sizes. They're not as successful, but given that 7% number, you can see that every little bit helps. So hunting on its own, I think we design it to have minimal impact. We only target bearded birds, which 90% of the time are males. So all that harvest pressure is focused on birds. We want to leave the hens alone as much as we can. I do want to do a quick plug. And I don't know if anybody's participated in this or not, but every year Vermont Fish and Wildlife does a citizen science project called the Vermont Turkey Brood Survey. And it goes the month of August. And it is an opportunity for folks to report sightings of turkeys, particularly hens with or without poults. Remember, it's as important to know if hens actually pulled off a brood or if they didn't. And scientists use that that data to get a measure of how successful was the breeding season. We call that the poult to hen ratio. So I'm sure you'll be seeing stuff about it on Facebook or email as we get closer to August. I strongly encourage all of you guys to participate in that. So talking about wild turkey declines, we've seen in some parts like New York, Arkansas, places that were strongholds of turkeys for decades, have seen declines of 40 to 65% in some parts of their range. Overall, we've seen turkey populations decline from a high of about 7 million back in 2004 down to 6.2 million in 2014. Okay, that's not what we're seeing in New England, and we talk about it. A lot of that, I think, in some of those other states was birds moved into the landscape. They flourished, right? They filled the landscape to carrying capacity and possibly above, and then just kind of had to maybe retract a little bit. But there's other indications that, particularly knowing what you know now about reproduction, that, there's the potential that quality nesting habitat has declined on the landscape. There may be, sorry, that was my dog. There may be, richer and more abundant predator communities. One of the things that was interesting was when New York was going through their trap and transfer stuff and their population was skyrocketing, that happened to coincide with a severe rabies outbreak in New York, which really suppressed the predator populations. And it could be that as those predator populations have bounced back over the last 15 years and stuff, they're having a greater impact on turkey populations. And like I said, I think nesting habitat and brood habitat are kind of like the critical pieces of the puzzle. So, I showed you one picture of brood habitat. I just wanted to show you a couple more and to give you a visualization thing. So the way I've heard it explained to me is they're like, go out and do a field that you think is brood habitat and then lie on your stomach, okay? If you can't see around you, neither can they, all right? And then if you look around and you're like, man, if I thought I was a little puffball the size of a tennis ball, if I thought that I couldn't thread my way through the stems and the vegetation and stuff, chances are a turkey poult can't either. So what you're looking for are these areas that are not super dense with vegetation. They need to be, it's this sweet spot of they need to be open enough that the birds can move around, but still have enough cover that they can avoid predators, okay? And I think we focused a lot of effort over the years on providing good nesting habitat, but brood habitat is something where I think we can do more of, and that could be an important piece of the puzzle. Now the good news is, I show this picture on the right here. This is an example of typical pollinator habitat. I'll be honest with you, there's not a lot of people out there looking to do conservation work for wild turkeys, right? I mean, there's turkeys everywhere, but the habitat that turkeys use are used by a variety of species of conservation need, whether it's something like American woodcock, ruffed grouse, golden winged warbler, New England cottontail, bumblebees and stuff. I mean, what's good for a lot of those species is also good for wild turkeys. And that's sort of the space that Ben and I operate in, where we're going out and helping landowners with those management objectives for those wildlife species, knowing that they're going to have tremendous benefit for turkeys as well. So that sort of is my stump speech on turkey biology and habitat. And before I move on to more habitat management focused stuff, does anybody have any questions?
So there's one question in the chat box from John. He wants to know, how dense can the shrubbery be to still make good brood habitat? And you may have answered that with the laying down kind of thing, but is too dense undesirable since it inhibits the turkey's movement? I have a field that I mow part of every 4 years or so on a rotating basis. I'm way behind on this, so at this point, the youngest part is probably about 3 years old. When also is the best time to mow so he avoids disturbing the nest?
Yeah, so I think that you tend to be looking at about a 3-year rotation for maintaining your fields for brood habitat. You want to limit too much woody intrusion, but if you have beneficial woody species that are providing soft mast or really good cover for turkeys or other species, I would retain those features and just mow around them. and like I said, having some of those shrubs on landscape, they're either providing hopefully good soft mast, or they're providing good cover from avian predators and that sort of thing. But definitely need to be going in there and mowing every 3 years, ideally 4 years. It gets to be, when you start to get past a certain point, you got to start getting more equipment out there to do the job, and it becomes that much harder. And the other thing I would say is, if you can avoid your mowing until at least like July 15th and ideally August 15th, I think you're going to really limit impact to ground nesting birds, is what I would say. So moving on to turkey habitat management. And Ben, you feel free here to step in here and tell me what I'm doing wrong here anytime. I think for those of you that don't know, Ben is our forester. Actually, Ben, why don't you take a second and just tell folks about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Ben Vicere. I work under the National Forestry Initiative for the National Wild Turkey Federation in partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So before that, I was a private consulting forester for 13 years. Wild Turkey Federation hired about 24 to 26 of us to be embedded in NRCS offices to help deliver conservation practices for forestry and wildlife.
So we're really lucky to have Ben, because I can sit here and talk about it, but Ben's the guy that's actually out there meeting with private landowners, and helping them implement management strategies on their property to benefit wildlife.
Yep.
So if you guys have any good technical questions, you have a really good forestry expert available to kind of delve into some of that. We talked about a lot of this, what turkeys require. And I just, I'll blip through some of this idea of roost sites. Shockingly, roost sites are not a limiting factor for turkeys in Vermont. There tend to be trees everywhere. And there are, there's plenty of, pine, hardwood trees, depending on the time of year. Those softwood species can really provide some thermal shelter for birds on cold nights. But that's not an issue for us. That's more in other parts of the country. We already talked about, nesting habitat. They like, initially early in the season, you generally find them in the woods where there's some remnant cover, or along forest edges where there may be some thicker shrub cover that they can nest under. If you don't have that on your property, there are some actions and activities you can take to help increase nesting habitat. Water is important to turkeys in ways indirectly, right? Like anything, when you're talking about habitat, you're talking about food, water, and cover. Turkeys get most of their water intake from vegetation that they consume, but water still plays a factor in them, and it can be areas where they gravitate towards to forage nearby. Brood habitat, I feel like I've beat this one to death, but it's really, these smaller openings adjacent to forest edges. They have some cover in them, some kind of shrub component, or nearby edge. They have lots of insects and weed seeds. There's a lot of these opportunities in some of these pastures that have kind of let go, or if you guys have, apple orchards, wild apple orchards that you maintain, there's all sorts of examples where you can get them power line rights of way. One thing I didn't really talk about was winter. Winter is sort of the other potential factor for us in the Northeast that states in the South don't have to deal with. If we get too much snow, that can really impact turkeys. And it's not just how much snow we have, it's sort of the quality of the snow that we have. If we get snow that's got a good hard crust on it, then it's not as big an issue for those birds, because they can still walk on that crust and they can go off and find food. If it's deep powdery snow and they can't easily dig in through it to get to acorns on the ground or something like that, they certainly can't walk easily through it. Their only option really then is to go back up in that tree and wait and hope the conditions improve. And they're able to do that, right? They can spend 10 days, 2 weeks or something sitting up in that tree, but much beyond that, and they're going to start to suffer mortality. And so on really bad winters, in northern parts of the state and New England, you can see winter kill from associated with snow. The other caveat to that is, if they're in poor body condition going into the spring, that can potentially impact their ability to nest or to successfully put off a nest or pull off a nest. So they may fall into that percentage of hens that don't bother to nest that year because they know that they just are not in a condition to do it. So, when we're talking about winter severity, we're trying to make sure that turkeys have food nearby to go to, whether that is deeper in the woods where they can scratch out and get acorns, or whether there's a crop field where there's waste grain there that they can search for. It could even be, a cow pasture where they go out and spread manure. That, we used to call that the hot lunch program, where they go out and spread manure in the wintertime, and the birds would just be in there behind them, digging through that for waste seed or bugs. So, winter, I guess I just talk myself out of it. So yeah, it's basically, if you got anything from standing grain, some of those apple orchards will have remnant trees and they'll just hop up on the limb and start eating them. It could be, the buds of other species, even like the buds of hemlock. What we need to do is, to hedge your bet against winter, you need to have a diversity of food sources on the landscape. And so that's another area where you as a landowner can make a difference. By just diversifying what's on your property.
Matt, can I interject?
Yes, sir.
So, and it's kind of a question. So I know in the Northeast, when people manage for deer, a lot of times I'll tell them not to overlook your south and west facing hemlock stands for winter cover. I'm assuming, as I've seen turkeys many times in those same areas in the wintertime, that those are also beneficial areas for wintering turkeys as well.
That's correct. Yeah, those benefits of those south-facing slopes tend to be slightly warmer, less snow cover, more generally hospitable. I mean, when winter starts to move in, turkeys are generally moving into the lowlands anyway. But if you have a southern facing slope on your property, you're already quote unquote positioned for success for doing habitat management to benefit wildlife in winter. Thanks, Ben. And so, we've kind of talked about what we need to do. And for us in the Northeast, if you want to do stuff for wildlife, for turkeys, you need good brood habitat that's going to benefit all sorts of wildlife. You're going to want to diversify the amount of hard mast and soft mast food sources that you have on the landscape, simply because, when you think of hard mast, automatically you're thinking of like oaks. But there's a variety of other species, beech trees, hickory, that sort of thing. They're producing important hard mast. There's soft mast. There's a gabillion different kind of, from apple trees to hawthorn to cherry that provide important soft mass for wildlife. The more diversity of species you have on the landscape increases your odds that at least one of those things is going to be providing an abundant food source that year, because you may have a bumper crop of acorns one year and then go 2 or 3 years where it's a bust. So the more different things you have on the landscape, the more chances are there's going to be something to find for those wildlife to eat. And just talking about habitat planning projects here, some of you guys might be Coverts cooperators. I think that is a fantastic program and a fantastic learning system. A lot of you guys are already ahead of the curve, and that you have maybe a forest management plan or a wildlife habitat management plan. But that's something where if you don't, you should be reaching out to someone like Ben or your local county forester, and they can, come out and discuss with you what are your objectives for your property. All right, what do you want to do? You want to benefit wildlife? Are you trying to increase timber value? Are you trying to do both? Are you trying to increase the view shed? And then, Ben, what's the first thing you're doing with a landowner when you go out and meet with them?
So, and it goes back to forest management. I mean, the first thing you do is you find out what their objectives are. That's thing one, what they want to do. And then you kind of take an inventory of what they've got and see where you can make improvements on things. In Vermont, 9 times out of 10, you're dealing with a forest that's maturing, or it's over mature, it's declining, and it's been high graded by previous logging operations. In a lot of cases, that was mostly due to lack of markets back when the initial high grading started. So almost 100% of these I go on, there's ample opportunity to put in a patch cut, create some early successional habitat, which will aid in all sorts of things. You're providing brood habitat at that point, edge cover, structure within the stand for various different species of songbirds. There's a myriad of things. So that's almost a given. Some of these places have got oak trees that are co-dominant or dominant trees, but they're being suppressed. So things like, we can help with mass tree release. There's a number of practices that I work with landowners on to improve upon what they have already.
So Lisa, if before we hang up today, if you can just put myself and Ben's email in the chat and stuff, so folks can reach out to us, especially Ben, if they have any questions. Mm-hmm. I just want to burn through some slides here real quick. If you're looking for easy ways to improve nesting habitat on your property, if you are going in and you're doing an apple tree release, or you're doing a light thinning or something like that, you can take some of those tree crowns, that sort of thing, and just pile them up and create what we call habitat piles. And they're ugly and messy. I'll clue you in on now. Habitat for wildlife is messy. If it's not messy, you're doing something wrong. All right. So these habitat piles are going to benefit rabbit, turkeys, grouse, basically anything that needs some escape cover. It's low impact, minimal effort, and it can have a big impact on your property. The other thing is, there's some work where deer densities are really a problem, and they are destroying the understory in a forest. And so if you're going in and you're doing a release or a thinning, one potential option, and this is from a photo of a project we did in New York with, it might have been with Audubon, is they just went in and just did a chop and drop, and left all the crowns, all the branches and everything right on the ground. It makes it that much more difficult for the deer to navigate through, and that can really be a boost to regeneration. So that's just something as an example I'm tossing out about what you can do. A lot of times when we're talking about good turkey habitat, and a lot of the habitat that Ben's trying to deliver in the state, as we try to increase age diversity of our forests, is doing some young forest habitat work. And you can see this is I'm just looking at an eyeball, but I'm going to guess this is probably something that's 3 to 5 years post cut. You can see the vegetative response to this patch cut area. It's really created a diversity of forbs and woody vegetation. This is what I think good nesting habitat can look like. Also, we'll have good components for brood habitat, lots of seeds, lots of soft mass, plenty of insects for these birds. So, other ways to get at it, if you have a hard edge on your property, consider doing what we call edge feathering, which is you remove right along the field edge, you remove a lot of the basal area, and then you move in another 10 yards, and you take a less percentage of the basal area. So you're kind of going from really open to more closed canopy, and just letting more daylight in is going to increase the diversity of species you have on the ground, and you're going to get a lot more response from young hardwood stuff, but then also a lot of these shrub species that are going to provide excellent nesting habitat for birds. So that's a good way to increase nesting habitat on your property without doing a big operation. You can just go in there, make a mess with a chainsaw. Again, chopping and dropping here. You don't need to make anything neat. You don't need to clean anything up. Just make a mess, let some daylight in, and see what comes up. The other sort of thing you can do is this idea of forest openings and brood habitat. There's a million ways to enhance things. It could just be as easy as you go in and you end up doing a a clear cut, and instead of letting it regenerate, you're going in there every 3 years or something like that and mowing it to maintain those grass and forb species. It could be, characteristics of this are lots of open, lots of bare ground. Remember that idea of you're a little turkey poult. You need to be able to get your way around and stuff. You don't want thick cover. A field, a homogenic field of reed canary grass is not doing anything to anybody and stuff. You want to get in there, till that up, get rid of that, plant something else, even let it, control the reed canary grass, and then maybe try to let it go fallow. Whatever, anything you do is going to be better than what's there. Other options here, you can plant annuals. A lot of folks don't do that, but that's always an option. You can do things like food plots, and I'm talking about going in and planting a clover mix. This has a benefit of it's good for pollinators, it's good for the soil, it helps increase nitrogen content in the soil. NWTF has a program to help defray the cost of that. Every spring we offer a sale on seed mixes to members. You can save, quite a few dollars if you're interested in doing food plot work. I'll actually probably be trying to do a couple food plot webinars here in the next week or two, if you guys have an interest in that. Apple tree release. Everybody's got apple trees on their property. Strongly encourage you guys to go in. Ben, that's a program, a practice you guys offer through NRCS to give assistance to landowners, right?
Yep, that is correct.
That's a great thing to do, and those are those like hidden gems hanging out in the woods, and you do a little bit of tender love and care, you can really bring them back, and that's going to benefit deer, turkey, bear, you name it.
Hey, Matt, I'm going to interrupt you here because we're rounding on 10, and I do want to get a few of the questions answered.
Sure.
So Mark was wondering about how you're determining that the turkey population in Vermont might be stable. Is it based on harvest rates or poult counts in August? He feels like his observation seems that there's been a decline in the last 10 years, at least in his region, and he's in the Hinesburg, Starksboro, Huntington area.
So that's a great question. Turkeys are notoriously hard to get a handle on from a population standpoint. They hang out in the woods, which means normal survey methods are really difficult. Game camera stuff is kind of difficult. So our best index of how a population is doing is through harvest and specifically hunter effort. So, I try to work pretty closely with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. Based on their harvest estimates, I would say the population is fairly stable, but they have put a new emphasis on, trying to get a handle on hunter effort, because you never know if your harvest is still over 5,000, birds. Is that because, are your hunters having to work harder to harvest those birds? Are there more hunters out there than there were before? Are there less? So it's an imperfect system, but aside from doing intensive winter banding every year to get at harvest rates, it's very difficult to get an estimate on population. So, if you're seeing declines, it could be local land use changes. It could be some of these things we've talked about today. But at a statewide level, I haven't seen any major trends that are concerning, aside from a bad production year here and there. I tell you what, Lisa, I don't think, most of my slides are mostly just talking about whatever mass tree release, but I'd rather just answer more questions if there are any, or, if anybody had final thoughts.
Sure, that's great. There are a couple more questions. So Julie said they had an infestation of grubs last year, and the turkeys seem to have enjoyed eating them and creating open soil areas to bathe in. Does this sound right? And also, is it okay to keep our compost pile open since they seem to come there for food scraps?
Yeah. So, I don't think that there's, if the turkeys are handling grubs, your grub problem and stuff, that's great. I've heard, on a positive note, I've heard reports, I have not seen this confirmed very much, but I've seen reports that, turkeys will eat 200 ticks a day or something like that. So they are out there foraging on insects. I'm not going to say like somebody once posed a great question, who does more for tick control, possums or turkeys? And I think the researcher gave it to possums in terms of just, they eat more ticks. But certainly turkeys are going to eat anything they come across. and that includes ticks or grubs. Your compost pile, I mean, I don't think there's any health concerns with letting those birds in there, but nuisance turkey management is sort of an emerging field in the Northeast. And there can be times when you don't want turkeys hanging out in your backyard, especially during the breeding season. They can get aggressive, and that's when you see them hop up on your car or start to chase mailmen and that sort of thing. And once they're there, they can be a little bit difficult to get rid of if you can't remove the food source. It's easy to put away the bird feeder for a few weeks. It might be harder to get rid of your compost pile.
Yeah, with mandatory composting now, there are going to be a lot of issues, bear, and so keeping your compost closed is probably a better recommendation, and let the turkeys find the wild bugs and the, work on your apple trees and creating better habitat, I would think. Peter notes he's noticed an active turkey management area on the Honey Hollow Road. Nice to see. So are there signs for active turkey management areas, or?
We had partnered with Vermont Forest Parks on doing some apple tree release work with our volunteers up at Camel's Hump, and it's been a really successful partnership these last few years. We've been going in the wintertime and doing some apple tree release and thinning. We actually have some. I know Matt Leonard's on the thing. We actually have some additional work planned where we're going to be doing a pollinator planting and a food plot demonstration site to kind of show how we're doing more for brood habitat and that sort of thing. So, that's a great area up there, and we have really engaged volunteers that want to do more in the landscape. So wherever we can, we're going to encourage that. Any of you guys want to get out and help with a volunteer project, please feel free to hit me up in an email.
Yeah, Ben, if you could type your email in the chat box. I don't actually know your email, but I put Matt's in the chat box for those that want to follow up with Matt. Can you tell us a little bit about the pollinator plantings? I know you did one at Dead Creek, and is there a list on where people maybe can go and see some of these tries at creating pollinator habitat that's also going to be good for broods?
We had done some on the Green Mountain National Forest off of French Hollow Road in Peru. Vermont. We had done one at Dead Creek last year. It's not going to look pretty. I'm just prefacing that now. It takes a couple of years for these things to get established, but it will be something eventually. I can also, we recently worked with Vermont Fish and Wildlife on getting a pollinator mix that checked all their boxes in terms of appropriate species to use in Vermont. So, I don't know the best way to get that to you, Lisa, but I'm happy to share that with you guys. If you're looking for a relatively affordable native pollinator mix for Vermont, I can definitely share that with you, Lisa, and you can, disseminate it as you see fit.
Sure, absolutely. All of you who are on the call will follow up with a survey, and I can put that information in that email. So if you send it to me, I'll send it out to our registered crew here.
Great.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat box. I know we did cut your slides off a little bit, but is there anything else you want to add at this point?
No, I guess I just encourage you to if you have an interest on how to make your property better, reach out to Ben or myself. If Ben, what's your territory in Vermont?
So in general, I cover Windsor and Windham counties, mostly on the Connecticut River side. But I do travel here and there when needed, but most of the work is the Connecticut River Valley, Windsor and Windham counties.
And then Ben works hand in glove with the Vermont Farm Bill team. So if you live in an area that's outside his territory, he can certainly pass you off to the most appropriate biologist or forester in that region to help you. Private lands is where the rubber meets the road. 80% of Vermont, something like that's privately owned. I can work all day on a national forest, on a wildlife management area, and know that I'm doing something good. But if I want to have a large scale impact, it comes down to private landowners. And so we want to make sure if you guys have, an interest or a passion for your property, that we're able to help you connect the dots and get that implemented. So whether it's just answering questions or helping to make recommendations on your property, take that extra step to reach out to somebody, whether it's us or county forester, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, Vermont FPR. You guys are already an engaged base, which is phenomenal. I love the Coverts program. And so anything we can do to help you guys be more successful.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ben and Matt, for joining us today. I think we learned a lot. I know I learned some new things about turkeys, so that's always exciting. And there's a great opportunity for doing good things on your property as a landowner. We have, actually the last thing we did before lockdown for COVID, we did an apple tree release with Matt, and I did one up on a cooperator's property, on Tracy's property up in Granville. And it was amazing. We had a great turnout and a lot of fun, and did some good things for those apple trees on that property. So we are often hoping to get together again in person at some point and do some of these things in person. Until then, we're continuing to offer these kinds of program online. So check our calendar, sign up for our e-news. Next week, we have coffee with the Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation, Mike Snyder. The following week, we have coffee with a consulting forester, and we'll have Alan Calfee on. And the following week, we've got Carolyn Loeb, who'll be talking about the Vermont conservation design. So you can really understand kind of what kind of private lands management may benefit in your region based on the Vermont conservation design. So lots of great things coming up. We really thank you all for being on the call. And I hope Ben and Matt are out there doing great things for turkey and on your property as well. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
You too. Thank you.